Hi folks, welcome to my little hobby channel where I talk about stuff that interests me and maybe you. Today I'm going to talk to you about 3 stories that I heard. I engage people in conversation from time to time and I've heard a lot of stories, but these 3 have stuck with me as odd stories because if they're true, you think you would have heard of them before. You think there'd be big enough news that you would have heard of them. So I'm going to tell them to you in the order in which I heard them. Let's get into it. Okay, the first story I heard 30 years ago, it was in Australia. It's from a guy I was working with at the time, a fella, he was a circus mechanic, about 70 years old. I think I have a picture of him that I'll stick up there. I don't think anybody would mind. He's probably dead now. He was 70 then, 100 now. He was a hardy guy, but he's probably not alive anymore. His name was Mick White.
Where are you going? Well, we got to go to a break place.
Nice guy, Mick. I would chat to him, and during the working day at times, over a cup of tea or whatever, sometimes over a beer at night. Mick came from Barmera, or Barmera, I think I've heard him say. And Barmera Berry Wakery was a run we used to do along the Murray River. Lovely part of the world. Mick was the circus mechanic. He had a truck that the inside of which was about 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters, and a lad's cave of parts and bits and pieces and tools. He'd be working on vehicles at 70 years old, keeping circus vehicles on the go. He told me this story. It involved his brother. His brother, he said, was on the so-and-so when she went down. Now he named, I'm pretty sure it was an Australian city or an Australian river, but I couldn't remember which. Because I forgot all about this story until the Kursk went down, and the Kursk went down in 2000, and there were men trapped inside, and all that attention on the Kursk reminded me of the story Mick had told me. He told me his brother was on this vessel when she went down. He was trapped in a compartment. There were 4 of them trapped in a compartment. They could get out, but somebody had to stay behind to operate a mechanism. Now, I had in my head that it was a torpedo tube. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't a submarine. Maybe it was a surface vessel. Maybe not all surface vessels have all their torpedo tubes on deck. Maybe there's some sort of internal torpedo tubes. I don't know. I looked into this. At the time of the Kursk, the internet was very young. There wasn't a whole lot on it. There was a lot. When I went looking, I was amazed at the amount of ex-submariners, bulletin boards and forums and chat rooms and things. And I did post this story there to see had anybody heard anything like it, but nobody had. So it may have been a submarine, it may not. It may have been a torpedo tube, it may not. 4 of them were trapped in this compartment as the vessel sank. They drew lots. 1 man stayed behind and let the other 3 out. And he was lost. Which is pretty grim when you think about it. Mick's brother was one of the lucky ones. I couldn't believe I couldn't find anything on that story. I would have thought if that had happened, that the guy who stayed behind would have got some posthumous medal, the best they could give him, the Australian Navy could give him, and that his story, that he'd have a ship named after him or something. If not a town, you know. But anyway, no, could find nothing. The next story I heard was towards the end of the 90s, round about 99. I was working with a fella, we were chatting off and on. He told me about his time in the RAF in his 20s. Now, I'd say he was in his 50s, mid to late 50s at the time. The story he told me was he was in the RAF. He got an odd order to show up for duty and be part of the crew of a flight. It was a Hercules or some similar transport plane. And it was outside his normal duties on his normal base with the normal people he worked with. And he found that the crew that was put together for this flight were similar people, just drawn from different places, put together, told to ask no questions. They loaded up with British troops dressed in American uniforms with American jeeps. He'd been given the impression they were flying to Africa, North Africa. That was the first stop. They flew on. He reckons they flew to Vietnam. He reckons they landed at an airfield that was under fire. They discharged their cargo of British troops in American uniforms, and they turned around and took off again and flew back. And he went back to his normal duties in his normal base. That was it. He says he thinks it was Vietnam and he thinks it was under fire. So Khe Sanh was 68. If he was 25 in 68, he'd have been 57 in 2000. So figures could be about right. I'd have thought if that was true, and I have no reason to doubt him, he didn't seem like he was bullshitting. If that was true though, I'd have thought some story would have come out by now. If presumably the explanation might be that British Special Forces wanted to get some real action, real life experience and help out their American allies. I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense that I couldn't find any corroboration for that either. And yet the guy seemed very much on the level. Another story he told me actually, he told me a few stories, but that's the one that stood out. The other story was he told me he turned up at some airbase, RAF airbase, and he wondered where everybody was. And he went into the canteen and was asking, where's everybody? And everybody had gone down to the hangars and climbed into the rafters and were refusing to come down from the rafters of the hangars until they got a change of CO. And there were negotiations and a deal was done or something. Anyway, they got a new CO apparently, but all the ringleaders were then dispersed and sent around the place, posted away. That's what he said. I think the guy was on the level. Right, that's the second story. The third story I heard about 10 years ago. An old man. I heard this story from him because a good friend of mine had got to know him and knew I'd find what he had to say interesting. So a good friend of mine, thanks Dave, had arranged this meeting in a pub in Dublin. Had a couple of pints. This guy had some interesting stories to tell about the literary people he used to drink with back in the 40s and 50s. Brendan Behan and Patrick Kavanagh, and he had some good stories. There's a good story about Patrick Kavanagh's underpants I won't go into. But this story involves the IRA. The guy was in the IRA in the 1940s. And the Germans. Now, just to be clear, there's been lots of different IRAs ever since the 1920s. They all claim to be the same one, but they're all actually different ones. They're all splinter groups of a bigger group. When a bigger group decides they've had enough with the violent stuff and they'll try politics, a hardline splinter group breaks off and says, oh, we're the real IRA, and that's been going on ever since the 1920s. The IRA in the 1940s was a bit of a Mickey Mouse organisation. It was Dublin based. This was long before the Troubles in the North. The losing side of the Civil War, Ireland had won independence from Britain for 26 counties in the Irish Free State in the 1920s, which had to have allegiance to Britain and taking your place in the Irish Parliament meant you had to swear allegiance to the Queen. I think it was the British head of state at the time, whoever it was, and also had to give up the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. There was a civil war between hardliners who didn't accept that in the 1920s, and the losing side of that civil war, those hardliners, had given up the gun and gone into constitutional politics, and they were governing during the Second World War. So they were the hardliners who had now taken power. And a splinter group from them was calling itself the IRA and was trying to cooperate with the Germans and hopefully get a German invasion of Ireland that would suit the IRA, because my enemy's enemy is my friend. That was the basis for it. So they were on the run, the IRA. The Irish Special Branch was after them. There was an internment camp in the Curragh of Kildare where, because of who it was in government, Eamon de Valera, because when Britain and France declared war on Germany over the invasion of Poland, Ireland had declared itself to be neutral and was not going to get involved in that conflict. And as the conflict developed, Ireland stayed neutral. Very controversial. I must do a video on it someday. The whole thing is controversial and interesting. Their thinking was, we're not going to ally ourselves with a country who's got troops and occupying 6 counties of our country, is the way they viewed it at the time. So Ireland walked a strange path as a neutral state, kind of leaning towards the Allies. They gave all the weather information to the Allies, and a lot of Irish people left and joined the Allies. There's been a fuss about them being treated badly when they came back. They weren't really. You will find people exaggerate that. The people that did get a hard time when they came back were people who had deserted the armed forces of the country and then gone and fought with the Allies. So that desertion was not looked upon too lightly, given the fact that there was a period of crisis. So they got a punishment when they came back. They weren't tried individually. They were given a common punishment. They were basically banned from many state jobs, which was letting them off in one sense, but given the amount of state employment at the time, it did limit their chances. That's the background to this. So this guy was in the IRA. This guy, his name was Liam Brady. He like the footballer. He was a tailor later in life, but he told me this story that he was the IRA's radio man. He had taught himself Morse code. He was in touch with a German U-boat. Now the IRA at that time, as I said, they were a bit of a Mickey Mouse outfit. They were trying to get in touch with the Germans. The story he told me was there was a submarine U-boat, German U-boat, off Wicklow Head. If you're dealing with code, he explained to me, every letter is key. If you send groups of letters, and if you mistake a long Morse letter for 2 short ones, for example, or you get a letter wrong, it can throw out the whole message. So he had to be exact about what he was receiving. He said, this is what he said to me. He said he was asking them to repeat so often that they spent so long on the surface that the Irish Navy captured the U-boat. Now, I've never heard of the Irish Navy capturing a German U-boat. I think if they had, we'd have heard about it. He told me that they were captured, that Eamon de Valera allowed the Germans come and take the U-boat away. I'd puss. Well, that the Germans came and took the U-boat away, but that the crew were interned. Now, it was the policy at the time for the Irish government to intern anybody from one of the belligerent nations who made it to Irish shores. So there were airmen and sailors interned in the Curragh camp. You were blocking out the microphone there, babe. So, hang on. Can you maybe sit there? How's about that? You all right? So, policy at the time was there was an internment camp in the Curragh of Kildare where the Irish Army base is now. There were two compounds, one for the Allies, one for the Axis powers, because there was people don't realise there was a lot of Italian stuff going on in the Atlantic as well. At one point, the Italians had hundreds of submarines, I think, in the Atlantic. People kind of don't talk about, but I'm not sure many Italians made it to Ireland. But anyway, there were Germans, there were British. I think a lot of Americans would have been hustled over the border quietly, but British and Germans were basically interned in the Curragh camp. They could go out in the evenings. They'd make agreements between themselves which pubs they'd go to, so that there wouldn't be any clashes, and they could go to the pictures and stuff like that. I think a lot of the Germans even got jobs in Irish farms and things. So they were basically interned. In between the two compounds was another internment compound, and that was for the IRA. So if the Irish government picked up IRA men, they were in there. This guy told me that he was interned, and eventually he got to meet through the wire the crew that had been captured through his action or inaction or his inept code work or whatever. So and he said he tentatively broached the subject with them, but they were delighted to be out of the war at that stage because the tide had turned. So they were pleased to be captured. So that all makes sense as a story. But if the Irish Navy had captured a German U-boat, we definitely would have heard about it. So I don't understand. He didn't seem to be bullshitting. He seemed to be very much on the level. It was almost a story against himself, if you know what I mean. And the only thing I could think of was that maybe, given it was late in the war, that the Irish government did allow the submarine to be taken away, the U-boat be taken away, but not by the Germans, by the Allies. And therefore it would have been all kept very hush-hush on both sides. De Valera would have been very anxious to make sure that stayed secret, because he was all about being proper on the surface. So much so that when Hitler died, he sent condolences to the German embassy in Dublin, the German legation, which is bizarre looking back on it, very controversial ever since. But to him, it was important to cross the T's and dot the I's on the surface of the neutrality thing. Whatever about it was being done underhand. So I don't know, if the Allies had acquired an undamaged U-boat, I think we'd have heard about that somehow as well by now. So I don't know. Anyway, those are the three stories that are odd. Maybe we'll hear something sometime that will corroborate one or all of them. So as we're talking about stories, folks, if you're young and if your grandparents are alive, please take the time to get your smartphone out, or laptop, or computer, or camera, and record an interview with them. Get their memories, get their stories down, because there's stuff in their head that'll be lost with them. You know, they will know things about their parents that you don't know. They will know things that they were told by their parents about their parents that you don't know, that nobody's written down. So do it. Just if you're old yourself and your parents are getting to the end of the conveyor belt, interview them. Old people are shy, but they don't mind talking about their lives if they're proud of it, if they're aware that it'll go on to the family generation, to the grandchildren. And to hear people tell the stories in their own voice is brilliant. It's very good. It's far better than saying, oh, I remember that somebody said to me. To hear it, to see a bit of their character as well is invaluable. It'll be more important than anything else they leave behind. Hopefully now you're thinking of somebody that you want to do that with, and if you have, now that I've made you aware of how important it is, the onus is on you to do it. That conveyor belt isn't slowing down. Next winter we'll take another crop. So do it. Tell them that you want it. for the next generation. And a lot of old people will be shy, but a lot of them will be proud of the lives they've led. And sit them down and just talk to them. Just tell them to forget about the camera and just ask them questions. And you'll be glad you did. Okay, folks. Goodbye now. Mind yourselves.